Buddy arrived at the shelter on a rainy afternoon, looking nothing like the hopeful, eager animals that typically filled the place. His fur, a mix of browns and blacks, was matted and damp, and his eyes held a quiet sadness that made him stand apart from the other dogs. The staff immediately noticed something different about him, a sense of distance, as if he was not just a dog, but a creature who had experienced too much of the world already. He didn't bark or whimper like the others. Instead, he simply stood still in the corner of his cage, head low, ears flat. His gaze was fixed on the door, watching every movement with an intensity that made the staff uneasy. He wasn't hostile. There was no growling or snapping at the hands that reached out to offer him treats, but there was a barrier, an invisible wall between him and anyone who tried to get too close. The shelter staff, seasoned as they were, could tell he wasn't your typical rescue case. Most dogs that came in were nervous, sure, or shy, but Buddy seemed to have a heavy weight on his shoulders. When new volunteers tried to coax him out with toys, Buddy would only take a few steps forward before retreating again. He would not sit, he would not roll over, and he certainly would not play. There was a reluctance in every movement he made, as though he was waiting for something that never came. Despite the kindness shown to him, Buddy remained distant. He didn't wag his tail or nudge at the bars like the other dogs when someone new walked through the shelter doors. Instead, he would retreat deeper into his space, pressing his back against the wall, never letting his eyes leave the person entering the room. His stare was intense, almost pleading, as if asking, "Why are you here? Why are you not who I am waiting for?" The shelter staff noticed his odd behavior quickly. Buddy wasn't aggressive, nor was he scared. It wasn't fear that kept him at a distance. It was something else entirely. His behavior was more subtle, almost like a quiet mourning that lingered beneath his calm exterior. He wouldn't show joy when people offered him treats or affection, but he also didn't show signs of distress. He simply existed in his own world, unresponsive to anything around him. As the days passed, staff members grew more concerned. Buddy was unlike any dog they had seen before, and though they tried their best to comfort him, they couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in his past, something buried deep, that was keeping him locked away from the world. As the days went by, it became clear to everyone at the shelter that Buddy was different from the other dogs. While most animals adapted to their new surroundings relatively quickly, Buddy remained a mystery. He did not react the way other dogs did when visitors arrived, nor did he seek out the attention of the staff. The volunteers were puzzled, and even the shelter's experienced staff members were starting to worry. Buddy's lack of interest in playing, his failure to warm up to people, and his strange, constant vigilance were unlike any behavior they had encountered. The other dogs would bark excitedly when new faces appeared, wagging their tails and leaping for attention. But Buddy just stayed put, his eyes never leaving the door, his body frozen in place. It was as if he was waiting for someone, as if he knew the world around him was wrong, and he couldn't move on until something was made right. There were attempts to break through his walls. Staff tried bringing in toys, treats, and blankets to comfort him, but Buddy wouldn't engage. He simply sniffed them, then walked away, retreating to the farthest corner of his enclosure. He didn't even show interest in the other dogs who came by to greet him. While the others romped and played together, Buddy remained still, an observer in a world he didn't seem to belong to. Megan, one of the volunteers who had taken a particular interest in him, would often sit by Buddy's cage, talking to him softly, hoping that her presence might provide some comfort. "It's okay, Buddy," she would whisper, her voice gentle and steady. "You don't have to be afraid." But Buddy never responded, not even with a shift in his posture. His eyes were calm, but they held a sadness that seemed unshakable. The volunteers couldn't understand it. Why wasn't he like the other dogs? Why did Buddy refuse to open his heart to the world around him? Some of the newer volunteers were quick to label him as unadoptable, assuming that his behavior was the result of a traumatic past. But Megan didn't want to give up on him so easily. There had to be more to Buddy's story, something deeper that no one had discovered yet. There was one thing that stuck with Megan more than anything. Buddy's gaze. It wasn't one of fear or anxiety, but of something else, something more painful. When their eyes met, she felt the weight of his quiet sorrow, and it tore at her heart. Buddy wasn't rejecting the world. He was waiting for it to make sense again. He was waiting for something to bring him back to life. Megan had always been intuitive with animals, and she couldn't help but wonder, what was Buddy waiting for? As the weeks passed, Buddy's strange behavior continued, leaving the staff increasingly puzzled and concerned. The other dogs had found homes, one by one, but Buddy remained in his corner, waiting. For what? No one could say. Visitors came and went, some interested in adopting a dog, others just passing through. But Buddy barely acknowledged them. And if they tried to approach his cage, he would back away, his eyes never leaving theirs, as if assessing their every move. It wasn't that Buddy was aggressive. He simply refused to connect with anyone. It was as though he had closed himself off from the world entirely. His food would go untouched some days, and on others, he would eat only a few bites before retreating back to his corner. The volunteers and staff tried everything they could think of to break through, from bringing in other dogs to encourage him to play, to offering special treats he once refused. But nothing worked. He wasn't scared of people. There was something else at play, something far more subtle and deeply rooted in his heart. Megan had spent countless hours with Buddy, talking to him, trying to make him feel safe. She knew there was more to his story. There had to be. There was something about the way Buddy observed the world that told her he wasn't just a victim of neglect or fear. He wasn't a dog simply waiting for a new family. He was waiting for something, someone. She just didn't know what that was yet. One afternoon, Megan found herself sitting by his cage again, watching him in silence. Buddy's eyes were focused, his body still, as though he were trying to decipher something invisible in the room. She sighed, brushing her hand through her hair in frustration. It was then that she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. Buddy had been staring at the door again, as he often did. But this time, he didn't flinch when the door opened. Instead, his eyes narrowed, his posture tensing slightly, as if he were expecting something. Megan's heart raced. For the first time, Buddy seemed aware, alert, as if he were waiting for someone. She stood up slowly, her thoughts racing. Could it be? Could he be waiting for his owner? The possibility struck her like a sudden realization. She had heard of animals waiting for their lost loved ones, but she had never seen it so clearly before. Was Buddy still waiting for the person who had abandoned him? Or worse, the person who had hurt him? Megan's mind spun with the weight of the thought. She needed to know more. She needed to figure out who Buddy was waiting for, and why. But for now, all she could do was watch him, hoping that somehow, in his silence, Buddy would finally reveal the truth. Determined to uncover the truth about Buddy's past, Megan knew she had to go beyond the shelter walls. She couldn't stand the thought of Buddy sitting in silence, waiting for someone or something he might never see again. There had to be an explanation, something that had caused him to become so withdrawn, so unwilling to trust the world. One quiet morning, Megan set out on her own to the area where Buddy had been found. She had learned from the shelter's intake records that Buddy had been discovered near a wooded area on the outskirts of town. No one had known where he came from, but the fact that he had wandered in from the woods seemed too deliberate to be a coincidence. There had to be more to this story. The drive took about 20 minutes, and Megan's mind raced with possibilities as she navigated the narrow country roads. The sky was overcast, a thin layer of mist clinging to the trees and fields, giving everything an eerie, quiet feel. When she finally arrived, she parked her car along the side of the road and stepped out into the chilly morning air. The woods were dense, the tall trees stretching above her like silent guardians. Megan walked slowly, letting her eyes sweep over the landscape. There was something hauntingly familiar about the place, but she couldn't place it. The wind whispered through the branches, the rustling leaves almost calming in their rhythm. But Megan's focus remained sharp as she ventured deeper into the woods. After some time, she stumbled upon something that sent a jolt of recognition through her. There, in a clearing, lay the remains of what appeared to be an old cabin. The wooden structure had long since burned down, the charred remnants of beams and walls barely standing. It was a desolate sight, a place where fire had consumed everything, leaving only ashes in its wake. Megan's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was where Buddy had been found. She could feel it in the air. This was the place he had come from. She knelt down among the ruins, carefully sifting through the debris. There were signs of the fire's devastation everywhere, but something caught her eye. Beneath the ashes, partially buried, she noticed a small, scorched hat. It was old, faded, and worn, but it looked like something a person would have worn. Could this have belonged to Buddy's owner? A chill ran down Megan's spine as she picked it up, holding it carefully between her fingers. She felt as though she had uncovered a piece of Buddy's past, a piece that might finally explain the pain and confusion in his eyes. With the hat in hand, Megan knew she couldn't stop now. She had to find out who had lived here, who had been a part of Buddy's life before he was brought to the shelter. Only then could she truly understand what was haunting him. The discovery of the scorched hat sent a shiver down Megan's spine, but she couldn't bring herself to leave just yet. She stood there for a moment, staring at the ruins of the burned cabin, her mind racing with questions. Who had lived here? Who had lost everything in the fire? And most importantly, who was Buddy to them? Clutching the hat carefully, Megan stood up and made her way back to her car. The weight of the object in her hands seemed to hold a kind of finality, as if it were a symbol of a story that had yet to be told. She wasn't sure where the next step would lead, but she knew she couldn't stop. Megan spent the rest of the afternoon knocking on doors in the nearby town, asking questions about the cabin. Most of the locals hadn't paid much attention to it. The cabin had been abandoned for years before it burned down. But she kept pushing, explaining her connection to Buddy, hoping someone would remember something that could help. Finally, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carlson stopped her as she was about to leave. "You're asking about that cabin," she said, her voice low and hesitant. "I know a bit about it. My sister, Doris, used to live out that way. She was close to the man who lived there. I think his name was Frank." Megan's heart skipped a beat. Frank. Was that Buddy's owner? "Do you know what happened to him?" she asked urgently. Mrs. Carlson nodded slowly, her eyes clouding with sorrow. "The fire. It was a terrible thing. Frank and his dog were there when it happened. The fire spread so fast, they didn't have time to escape. Frank didn't make it out. But his dog, well, some folks say it ran off into the woods." Megan swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in her throat. This was it, the connection she had been searching for. Buddy had been Frank's dog. He had been there, in the fire, and somehow he had survived. Mrs. Carlson's voice grew softer as she continued. "The dog. I think it was waiting. After the fire, people said they'd seen it wandering around, but it never went near the town. It just stayed out there, near the woods. Some folks thought it was too afraid to come out of hiding. Maybe it was, waiting for Frank to come back." Megan's mind reeled. Buddy had waited for his owner, the man who had saved him, loved him, and who had perished in the fire. It was no wonder he couldn't let go. Buddy had been waiting for someone who would never return. As Megan left Mrs. Carlson's house, the weight of the truth settled over her. Buddy's past was darker than she had imagined. But now she knew what she had to do. She couldn't let him live with that pain any longer. Megan sat quietly in her car, the scorched hat resting on the passenger seat beside her. The revelation Mrs. Carlson had shared was more than she had expected. Buddy hadn't just lost his owner in a fire. He had witnessed the unthinkable. Frank, the man Buddy had likely followed and trusted, had perished, and Buddy had somehow survived, alone, wandering the woods. The pieces were falling into place, but the truth was heavier than Megan had anticipated. Buddy hadn't just been abandoned. He had been left behind in the wake of a tragedy. His reluctance to interact with people made more sense now. He wasn't simply afraid or mistrustful. He was mourning, and perhaps he had been waiting for someone who would never come back. Megan's mind raced as she thought about how she could help Buddy. The shelter had done everything they could, but they hadn't truly understood the depth of his pain. Buddy wasn't just any stray dog. He was a survivor of something horrific, and that trauma had locked him inside himself. She decided to go back to the shelter, where Buddy's silent form waited for her. He was the same as always, sitting in his corner, eyes alert but distant. But when she entered his enclosure, something in her shifted. She knelt down in front of him, holding the scorched hat in her hands. His eyes flicked toward it, then back to her, a brief flicker of recognition in them. Buddy didn't move. He didn't wag his tail or stand up. But for the first time, he didn't retreat. Megan spoke softly, her voice almost a whisper. "Buddy, I know what happened. I know about Frank. I know you were his dog." For a long moment, Buddy just stared at her. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotion. Then, slowly, Buddy shifted. He lowered his head, resting it gently on the ground, eyes closing as though in deep thought. Megan's heart ached as she watched him, realizing that he wasn't just shutting down. He was processing the pain, perhaps for the first time in years. Her voice trembled as she continued, "It's okay, Buddy. You don't have to wait anymore." With those words, something inside Buddy seemed to shift. He took a cautious step toward Megan, then another, as if testing the waters. His movements were slow, hesitant, but there was a shift in his posture. He was no longer just guarding his heart from the world. He was reaching out, even if it was only just a little bit. Megan held out her hand, and after a long moment, Buddy gently touched his nose to her palm. It was the first time he had actively sought contact with her. In that simple, fragile moment, Megan knew that Buddy was beginning to heal. Not entirely, not yet, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, Megan kept coming back to the shelter to visit Buddy, now more determined than ever to help him heal. She had begun to understand that Buddy's struggle wasn't just about adjusting to a new life. It was about overcoming the deep pain of loss, a grief so raw that it had rendered him silent, untrusting, and distant for so long. Each day, she tried to make him feel safe, gently coaxing him to interact with her in small ways. At first, Buddy would only let her sit near him, his eyes always cautious, but never leaving her face. She spoke to him softly, as if her words were a balm for his soul. "You don't have to be afraid, Buddy," she would say. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Slowly, Buddy began to show signs of change. One afternoon, Megan sat down on the floor near his enclosure, a few feet away. She reached into her bag and pulled out a toy, a simple ball that she had brought for him. Buddy didn't immediately retreat. Instead, he watched it, his gaze softening. She tossed the ball gently toward him, and for the first time, he didn't shy away. The ball rolled across the floor and stopped near his paws. Buddy sniffed it carefully, then nudged it with his nose. Megan held her breath. She had never seen him show any interest in anything before. Slowly, she stood up and took a few steps back. "Go ahead, Buddy," she whispered. "You can play." Buddy took another step toward the ball, then another. His tail flickered for the briefest moment, and for the first time since his arrival, he nudged the ball with a little more force, sending it skittering across the floor. Megan couldn't help but smile, a surge of hope rising in her chest. It was a small step, but it felt like a breakthrough. Buddy was beginning to play. He was starting to trust again. That night, Megan sat in her car outside the shelter, reflecting on how far Buddy had come. She had watched him go from a dog who couldn't even bear to look at anyone to one who was cautiously reaching out, inch by inch. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't easy, but it was progress. She realized that healing took time, especially for a soul as broken as Buddy's. In the days that followed, Buddy grew more comfortable with Megan. He still wasn't completely open, but he began to accept her presence more willingly. There were moments now when he would nudge her hand, asking for affection, or sit by her side without retreating. He was beginning to trust again, not just in Megan, but in the world around him. Megan knew that Buddy wasn't ready to forget everything he had been through. That would take time. But she also knew that with each small step, Buddy was reclaiming the life that had once been stolen from him. And with her by his side, he would get there. Together, they would heal. As spring arrived, the days grew warmer, and the shelter took on a new sense of hope. Megan continued to visit Buddy every day, and with each passing week, his transformation became more evident. No longer the distant, broken dog he had once been, Buddy was starting to show signs of joy, small but significant moments that made all the difference. One afternoon, Megan entered the shelter to find Buddy waiting by the door of his enclosure, as if he knew she was coming. He wasn't retreating into his corner anymore. He was standing, his tail wagging tentatively. When he saw Megan, his entire body seemed to relax, and he padded over to her, his eyes warm with recognition. "Hey there, Buddy," Megan said softly, kneeling down to greet him. His response was immediate. He pressed his head into her palm, nuzzling her gently as if to say, "I'm ready." For the first time, Megan saw the trust in his eyes. The trust that had been buried beneath layers of grief and fear. Buddy had come a long way. He had stopped waiting for Frank. He had stopped mourning the past. Instead, he was learning to live again. The world around him no longer felt like an overwhelming place filled with loss. With each passing day, Buddy was beginning to see that there was more to life than the pain he had carried for so long. Megan could feel the change in the air as Buddy started to seek out more connection. He now enjoyed the daily walks they would take together, and he would happily trot beside her, his steps lighter than before. He had started to greet the other dogs at the shelter with less hesitation, and sometimes he even joined in their games. Megan couldn't help but smile as she watched Buddy interact with the other dogs. He wasn't the shy, withdrawn animal who had arrived at the shelter months ago. Buddy had blossomed into a new version of himself, one that was ready to embrace the love and joy he had once lost. It wasn't long before the shelter received an inquiry about adopting Buddy. The couple who had come to meet him were kind and patient, and when they interacted with Buddy, he responded in a way Megan had never seen before. He wagged his tail, gently nudged their hands, and even gave them a soft lick on the cheek. For the first time in so long, Buddy seemed eager to connect with the people who were offering him a new home. When Megan watched Buddy walk out the door with his new family, a sense of peace settled over her. She knew he was ready. He wasn't the same dog who had been found in the woods, lost and alone. Buddy had found his place in the world again. And for Megan, that was all she had hoped for, to help Buddy heal, to help him find his peace. And as he left the shelter, Buddy was no longer waiting for someone from the past. He was finally living in the present, with a future full of love and possibility.